Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Aaron Golub, a professor in the School of Urban Studies and Planning here at Portland State University, and I'll be introducing today's seminar. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are once again held live on Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and honor their legacies, lives, and descendants. Today, we are pleased to have Jason Anderson of PSU and Clay Veka of PBOT presenting on speed management and speed reduction in Portland, Oregon. Am I saying that right? Clay Veka? Okay. Veka. Okay. Thanks. Sorry. Dr. Jason Anderson is a research associate here and adjunct professor at Portland State. Dr. Anderson's expertise is in data analytics, particularly advanced statistical and econometric methods with an emphasis on transportation safety, transportation economics, travel behavior, and policy, especially impacts of policy changes on safety. His work on policy-related contexts has led Oregon to develop and maintain a safety action plan aimed at reducing truck driver at fault crashes on state highways. He was also part of a team that updated Oregon's safety investigation tools. Clay Veka is the Vision Zero coordinator at Portland Bureau of Transportation, PBOT. She's also worked on traffic safety for 15 years, including joining PBOT's Vision Zero team when it launched in 2015. Clay has a master's degree in urban design and planning from the University of Washington. Here is a preview and just a look at some of the speakers we have for the fall series. And so we hope you join us again. And just as a preview of today's seminar, our speakers will present for about 40 minutes, followed by some Q&A. We can receive questions through the Q&A feature on your control panel, and we will ask them at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time, we will give the speakers the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the closed captioning feature on your control panel to view them. We will be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today, along with the slides. If you're tracking professional development hours, the webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. With that, I'll hand it over to Jason and Clay.
And thanks for the introduction, Aaron. So I'm Jason, and we'll be talking about speed management and speed reduction in Portland, Oregon. Really happy to be presenting this work today. And I'll be presenting with Clay from PBOT. And so Clay, thanks so much for being here. So the outline for today is Clay's going to speak a little bit about Vision Zero within the context of Portland and the Portland metropolitan area, as well as the speed management process within Portland and the Portland metropolitan area. And then I'm going to come back and give a couple examples in regards to case studies, one being a speed limit reduction on residential streets throughout the city of Portland, and then a second, speed limit reductions on arterials and collectors also throughout the city of Portland. So for now, I'll pass it over to Clay, and she'll give us some information on Vision Zero, as well as the speed management process in Portland. I guess I should have just held on to that.
I guess I know there's a lot of clipping here. Hi, it's really nice to be here today. We get clipped on. I appreciate Jason's partnership and the opportunity to set a little bit of context about how the speed work that Jason's done fits into Portland's Vision Zero program. I'm Clay Veka, use she, her pronouns. I am the Vision Zero coordinator at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. And Vision Zero is Portland's goal to eliminate traffic deaths and serious injuries. It's a data-driven program. We rely mostly on traffic crash data and equity data, specifically income and race data, in order to identify areas for safety improvements and communities most burdened by traffic violence in Portland. In addition, we also rely quite a bit on speed data, really specifically to measure the impact of various interventions on Portland's streets and the impact on reducing speeds that those interventions have. I'm going to quickly orient us to Portland's Vision Zero work and how this research fits in. Vision Zero is elimination of traffic deaths and serious injuries, and it is the goal. The approach that we and others around the country are using to achieve that goal is a safe system approach. It's really looking at how do we build a system that is safe and gets people where they're going at the end of the day and the beginning of the day and all throughout the day. There's 4 elements that Portland's really focusing on with a safe system approach. Redesigning our biggest, fastest, widest streets to slow speeds and provide multimodal travel, especially supporting safe travel for people outside of vehicles. Safe speeds is really at the core of our Vision Zero work. If we can slow speeds, the likelihood of a crash occurring is reduced, and when a crash does occur, it's less likely to be serious or fatal. Safe vehicles, it includes safety upgrades to vehicles such as the side guards that City of Portland has added to our heavy vehicle fleet, and many of our contracting waste management companies have also added. It includes advocating for better, stronger federal policies for integrating safety technology into existing vehicles, consideration of policies for encouraging smaller vehicles in the city. And then safe streets is really like designing streets to give kind of us cues about who to expect to be there and how to travel safely on those streets. But we also really need people to be making safe choices, to drive slowly, to drive sober, and to drive alert. And so we use these messages to share with the public, and it's kind of an important element of pushing for this culture change of moving away from car domination on our streets to slower multimodal streets. This is a speed campaign that I chose because we're running it right now. You might have seen on the backs of buses or out on billboards. Slow the Flock Down was launched by Seattle in partnership with Portland. Within the safe speeds element of those 4 elements of safe systems, there's 4 ways that PBOT is really looking at getting at safe speeds. So setting safe speed limits, redesigning dangerous streets to encourage safer speeds, enforcing the speed limit through automated enforcement. We have 8 speed safety cameras on the street and are increasing those numbers over the next few months, and educating Portlanders about the impact of speed. Today, we'll really focus mostly on speed limits, but you'll see that Jason's also going to get into the second 2 bullets. This chart shows the percentage of Portland's about 2,100 miles of street by speed limit, with about 3/4 of them being 20 miles per hour on residential and business district streets, followed by 8% at 25 miles per hour and kind of going down from there. Since 2017, we've reduced speeds on about 210 miles of streets, not including the residential streets. And we did that 20 is plenty reduction from 25 to 20 on all those residential streets. So this is in addition. The process of reducing each speed limit has been lengthy, tied to the 85th percentile speed. So really kind of bumping those speeds up and subject to ODOT approval. Reducing speed limits, it's really important as a transportation agency that we're communicating to the traveling public what an appropriate speed on a given street is based on the context, the users to expect on the street, and the land use. And so speed limits is a place that we really do focus our attention and energy, recognizing those other 3 pieces of speed setting, speed management are critical that I showed on a previous slide. And my last slide shows a refreshed approach to setting speed limits on streets in cities in Oregon. Following new legislation in 2021, ODOT has adopted rules that allow more flexibility in local decision-making on setting speed limits. This chart shows the new methodology for kind of the range of speed limits that we can target for different streets. And it now considers the 50th percentile instead of 85th, roadway classification, and importantly, land use context and kind of the surrounding development of a street segment when looking at setting speeds on a street. So really exciting. It'll provide us more flexibility to set speeds that are responsive to the multimodal urban environment that we're operating in. So I'm going to hand it to Jason, but I want to make a final kind of shameless plug. Our team is hiring for a speed management specialist to lead this work that I just overviewed now. If you Google Speed Management Specialist Portland, you'll find it. If you're interested or know others who might be interested, please consider looking. We're looking forward to a diverse candidate pool. Jason, thank you. It's very appropriate.
Awesome. Thanks. But so just before I move on to the next slide, I'm actually working on a project that's assessing ODOT's new speed zoning methodology and management process. So maybe a future transportation seminar can be on that down the road. So Clay gave you all a really good background on Vision Zero within Portland, the speed management process, the steps to arrive at Vision Zero. And so what I'm going to do now is go over a couple of case studies. The first one being the speed limit reduction on residential streets throughout the city of Portland. So in January of 2018, the Portland City Council approved reducing the speed limit on all residential streets from 25 miles per hour to 20 miles per hour. Now, a residential street is a street that's in accordance with this Oregon statute, and you're welcome to Google that Oregon statute for a little bit more detail. But ultimately, federal classified arterials and collectors were excluded, even if they're in like this residential district. And so the 20 mile per hour speed went into effect on April 1st, 2018. So these large signs, I'm sure many of you have seen them. I actually live on the very fringe of the Portland metropolitan area. And in my neighborhood, there's still a lot of 20 is plenty signs. So these new speed limit signs and updated ones were installed from February 2018 about through May 2019. So a little over a year process installing these new signs and updating existing ones. It increased the total number of residential speed limit signs to more than 2,000. So it's a pretty substantial increase. And then there was also this accompaniment of an educational and awareness campaign, 20 is plenty. And as part of this, as I mentioned in my neighborhood, there were a whole bunch of yard signs distributed to residents across these areas where these residential speed limit reductions took place. And again, this isn't just for Portland. I've seen these signs at various neighborhoods throughout the area. So let's talk about the speed data. So to assess this, we need some type of data. So we analyzed before and after speed data at 58 particular locations. And then this graphic here is just a visual of the before data collection periods as well as the after data collection periods. And then that thick vertical line here is when that speed limit reduction took place. So that April 2018. So all the speed data were collected via pneumatic tube counters. So if you've seen those tubes that are perpendicular to the roadway, you know, sometimes there's two in succession. Those are the pneumatic tubes that were used to collect this speed data. And then before and after speed data were collected during mostly weekdays with a few weekends. And then the duration ranged across these different locations, anywhere from 24 hours to 97-ish hours. So here's a spatial distribution of the 20 mile per hour reductions or the 25 to 20 mile per hour reductions. As we can see here, most of the locations are on the east side of the river, However, there are some locations on the west side of the river. And we did conduct a spatial analysis to determine if the locations here, if there was any type of spatial correlation between results, and we found that there was indeed none. So before we do the analysis with the speed data, we need to make sure that we're working with data that is quality, that we don't have any erroneous types of observations in the data. And so we conducted a quality control, which consisted of removing any observations in which the speed was 0, and then any observations in which the speed was greater than 100 miles per hour. In addition to that, we also did visual inspections for each site at the before and after period via the type of distribution that you see on this graphic here. So this just shows for a location at North, I'm going to mispronounce the street name, Bowden Avenue, east of Westana Ave. This is a before period. This is the distribution of the speeds at that particular location. This speed distribution follows a distribution that we would expect, and therefore it passed the quantitative component. So the speed equals 0 miles per hour or greater than 100, as well as the visual inspection. And then in this table here just summarizes the data quality control or the data cleaning process. Ultimately, it shows how many observations we started with, how many observations were removed, and then what that percentage is relative to the total number of observations that we started with. And for this study in general, it was really consistent with the before, the after data. And so you see that those numbers in bold being the total number, also pretty consistent. So what did we do with the data? How did we describe, was this effective? How do we describe the trends? We did that through two particular methods, the first being a descriptive analysis. So that included mean speed, median speed, 85th percentile speed, and then 3 different buckets. So the percent of vehicles exceeding 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, 10 miles per hour over the speed limit, and then 35 miles per hour or 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. And so the visual you see here on the right is a map where the larger blue dots indicate a larger reduction in mean speed after the reduction. The smaller blue dots, still a reduction in mean speed, but not as large. And then any red dot here you see actually had an increase in mean speed after the reduction. And then the larger the red dot, the larger that increase was. And you see here we have much more blue dots than we do red dots. We also wanted to assess the effects of reducing the speed limit through a more quantitative and analytical type of approach. And for this, we did 2 types of models. We did what's called a log linear regression model, and we did a series of binary logit models. So without getting into the weeds too much on the methodology side, the log linear regression model allows us to interpret the effect of this speed limit reduction in terms of the percent increase or decrease that we would expect in observed speed. The binary logit models allow us to determine what is the likelihood of observing speeds above these given thresholds. So here's a summary of the descriptive statistics results. And I really just want to focus on the disaggregate numbers here, which are the increases by the number of sites. So we see here that almost 60% of the sites had a decrease in mean speed. About 3/4 of the sites had a decrease in median speed, and then nearly 90% of the sites had a decrease in 85th percentile speed. Now, what's really notable is the percent of sites that had a reduction in these greater speed thresholds. So there was 75% nearly of the sites saw a reduction in vehicles traveling 5 miles per hour over the speed limit. 70% saw a reduction in vehicles traveling 10 miles per hour over the speed limit. And then just over 70% saw a reduction in vehicles traveling over 30 or 15 miles over the speed limit. So this is really key here as these speed thresholds or these larger speed buckets, the number of vehicles we see in there has substantially reduced at these sites.
The 50 miles over the speed limit before, was that 40 miles an hour, or was it still, because the speed limit was 25 before?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So these are relative only to the 20 miles per hour. So those of you on Zoom, the question was if these these thresholds are referenced to the before speed limits, and the answer was that they're referenced only to the 20 miles per hour, so after the reduction. So here's a table. There's a lot of results here, but what I really want to focus on is what's outlined in red. And so this is that more quantitative approach where we can fit these statistical models and we can estimate the effect of this treatment on observed speed. And an advantage of doing it this way is it allows us, as you can see, to account for a variety of different factors, whether it's temporal characteristics, roadway characteristics, if the data is available. And so we can control for the effects of these while also getting an estimated effect of what that treatment is. And in this case, reducing the speed limit from 25 to 20 miles per hour. So how we would interpret this then is that decimal is negative 0.010. Because we have a log linear model, we interpret this a little bit different. We're going to multiply it by 100. And so this would tell us through the more quantitative approach that we would expect a decrease of about 1% in speed on average. And so this confirmed what we were seeing in those descriptive analysis results, while also controlling for these site-specific variations. And then the second part is we did the binary logit models so that we could determine the likelihood of observing vehicles above these speed thresholds in these larger speed buckets. And so what we see here are an estimated change in the odds of observing vehicles greater than this speed threshold. So 5 miles per hour over the speed limit, 10 and 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. And the results, again, are right in line with what we saw from the descriptive results, where as we get higher in these speed buckets or these speed thresholds, we have a really larger percentage of reduction in odds of observing these speeds over these thresholds. So about 16% reduction in observing speeds 5 miles per hour over, 34% observing 30 miles per hour over, and then nearly 50% reduction in odds of observing speeds greater than 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. And just as an aside, these models also accounted for those site-specific variations as well. So time, roadway characteristics. So a brief summary on the residential streets. So the models, as I mentioned a couple times, confirmed what that descriptive analysis showed us, while also controlling for those site-specific variations. The analysis did suggest that the reduction resulted in lower observed speeds and fewer vehicles traveling at those higher thresholds. So that 5 miles per hour greater, 10, 15 miles per hour greater. The largest change observed we saw were in the 30 mile per hour buckets, so greater, and then the greater than 35 mile per hour buckets. And then we also saw that the models, the more quantitative approach, showed that roadway characteristics indeed play a role on vehicle operating speeds. And Clay had mentioned some of that in the beginning about it's not just setting space or safe speed limits, it's these other factors as well. So the next case study I want to go into is the speed limit reduction on arterials and collectors. This one's a little bit more involved, and I'll get into why here just in a few minutes. So like the previous analysis, we need some form of speed data. We need data to be able to determine trends and determine if these speed limit reductions had some effect on vehicle operating speeds. The duration of data for this particular case study at all sites consisted of at least 24 hours. So there was a bit more variation within the durations for these data sets than with the residential speed. This data was interesting because some of the after periods were at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we had 1 arterial location and 23 collector locations that had data collected in 2020. So what do we do? So I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about traffic data in COVID-19. So at the end of March 2020, early April, we started seeing stay-at-home orders nationwide. And because of these stay-at-home orders, we saw some pretty significant changes in both travel patterns, travel trends, as well as driving behavior and driving patterns during this time. One of the key ones was that we had a reduction in traffic volume, which led to a pretty significant reduction in congestion. And then this remained in effect till about February 2021. Around that time, we started seeing pre-pandemic VMT levels. So with fewer vehicles on the roadway, a lot of research that was happening at the time found that they were observing much more high percentage of risky driving behavior, where speeding was one of the most common among those different risky driving behaviors with fewer vehicles on the roadway. Some statistics, average speeds increased during the last 3 quarters of 2020. So each quarter it increased. Speeds greater than 20 miles per hour over the speed limit were far more prevalent. This was true across the board with passenger vehicles, freight vehicles. And then despite decreases in vehicle miles traveled, speeding involved crashes increased. Now, similar trends were experienced not just in Oregon, but across the country. And so considering this, we needed to take a step back and consider this 2020 data separately. So here's a map of the different collectors and arterials that were considered for this analysis. Your arterial locations are those light blue triangles. Your collectors are those darker blue circles. And you see we have a wide variety in spatial distribution across Portland. So the one primary difference, other than the roadway classification component, where we're no longer on residential streets, was that each classification had various speed limit reduction groups. So we couldn't just pull all of these together. We had to look at each of these separately. So let's looking at arterials, which is that lighter blue bar plot on your left. Notice that we had 1, 2, 3, 6 different speed reduction categories. And then the largest was that 35 to 30 miles per hour. And so each of these different speed reduction groups, we call them, were looked at independently. And that if any 2020 data was present or another type of treatment, which I'll discuss in a minute, those were pulled out and also looked at separately. On the right, with that darker blue purplish bar plot, again shows different speed reduction categories for the collector functional classification. The collectors had 5 different speed reduction groups, and each one of these, again, were analyzed separately. Now, in this data, we also had locations that between the before collection period and the after collection period, there was some type of treatment, speeding treatment that was implemented. So, and this was for the collector classification group, not the arterial. And so in the 35 mile per hour to 30 mile per hour reduction groups, there were 3 of which that had speed bumps installed during the before or in between the before and after period. And the 40 mile per hour to 35 mile per hour group, there were 3 locations that had fixed speed safety cameras installed between that before and after period. And then there were also a large group in the 45 to 40 mile per hour reduction. In fact, it was all of the locations within that group also had fixed speed safety cameras installed in between. And as we'll see with the results, we saw pretty consistent changes across all metrics. So the image on the lower right is an example of one of the speed bumps at one of the 35 to 30 mile per hour locations. And on the right, on Marine Drive, if you look to the far right of the photo, you'll see those fixed speed safety cameras. And that's an example of one of the 45 to 40 mile per hour locations. So this is real busy. And everyone will have access to the slides, but what I really want to focus on is what's in red. And so here we have 2020 data, 2021 data, as well as these are the locations that had some type of speeding treatment implemented in between the before and after periods. So what I want to point out is notice the percentages in parentheses, with the exception of one site for a decrease in vehicles 50 miles per hour over the speed limit, and then one site that didn't have a decrease in their 85th percentile speed. We observed that regardless of the year of the data, meaning those abnormal vehicle travel trends and driving patterns, risky driving behavior, that regardless, these, in addition to reducing the speed limit, these speeding treatments were effective. We see that there was a reduction in every metric across the board at these particular sites. So we follow the same type of methodological approach for this study. So descriptive analysis, which we just saw a big table of that. And then also the more quantitative side, where we wanted to fit these models to get some estimate from the treatment on the effect of observed speeds. Now, this one was a little bit different because, as we've seen, we had these various different speed reduction groups. And so we tackled this in a few different ways. So one approach was that we went ahead and disaggregated all the data, and we created 5 different models or 6 different models based on how many speed limit reduction groups there were. Another approach was to treat this as like a spatial panel, if you're familiar with panel data, where we can apply very specific approaches and treat the panels as these speed limit reduction groups. So 30 to 25, 35 to 25. And then the final approach was to do this pooled type of model where we're able to use all of the variation and information in the data, and we just create these indicator variables. So 1 if some condition is met, 0 if it's not. And we can simply estimate these within the model, and we can give ourselves an effect overall across all locations, regardless of their speed limit reduction. And so that's what you see here. And so notice, before I get to the results, I want to point out the change group. So the change group section, these estimates are what allow us to do the model this way. And notice that all of these are positive, meaning that we would expect some type of increase in observed speed. Now, this is expected as a speed limit of 25 miles per hour compared to the baseline, which is 20 miles per hour, we would expect higher speeds. We would expect higher speeds at the next speed limit group, and so forth. And so we see that increasing relative to that base case. Now to focus on what was the effect of the speed limit reduction while controlling for these different factors: temporal characteristics, vehicle types, if the data collection period was in 2020, what was the change group. And we found that on average, across all of the arterials, while controlling for these different characteristics, we would expect about a 2% reduction in observed speed. Likewise, and again, I know this is a really busy table, but it's important to show that we're controlling for these different change groups here, which allow us to approach it in this manner. And so I want to focus on 2 scenarios here. The first are the speed countermeasures. So we had the collector group, as we've seen, there were the fixed speed safety camera safety treatments, and there were also the speed bumps. And so one thing I want to point out is the speed bumps installed, we would expect this to have a decent effect on observed speed. And that's what we're observing here, about a 4% reduction on average in observed vehicle speeds. What we found interesting was the positive, albeit approaching 0, effect of the fixed speed safety cameras. Now, if we think back to that table, and there was one site that had an increase in a couple of those metrics, this estimate is picking up some of that. And I'll talk about, when I conclude, about ways that we can maybe address that. So then focusing then on the before-after period here, this gives us an effect of the speed limit reduction, regardless of what the reduction was across all groups on observed speeds. And across all collectors, the estimate tells us that we would expect about a 2.7% reduction in observed speed. So both positive results for both the arterials and collectors, regardless of the speed limit reduction group. And just to reiterate, we did a series of models, and the series of disaggregate data models confirmed what we were seeing here in this pooled model as well. So to briefly summarize the models, both the pooled and disaggregate, and you're more than welcome to reach out to myself or Clay for more information on the disaggregate approach. Confirmed, as did the models with the speed limit reductions on residential streets, the descriptive analysis portion. And we were again able to control for those site-specific variations. As I just mentioned, we would expect a decrease of about 2% in speed across all arterials. So that terminology is important, across all arterials. That's why we form the framework in that way. And then we would expect a decrease of about 2.7% across all collectors. And then I mentioned this before, is that some that the speed safety camera had a positive effect. And there was that one site that didn't have a reduction in a couple of those metrics. It's possible, and not to go down this rabbit hole too much, it is possible that some of those variables can have varying effects on observed speed, and they would require an alternate modeling approach, which is something we've actually discussed. So to summarize and conclude, the effectiveness of lowering speed limits. Was it effective? Was it not effective? Well, the data suggests that on average, the vehicle speeds are lower, both for the residential reductions as well as the collectors and the arterials. Most effective, as we saw, was not just lowering the speed limit, but also some type of accompanying speed treatment. Our examples that we saw were fixed speed safety cameras and speed bumps. And then roadway characteristics, as we saw with the residential speed limit reductions, do play a role. So what are some areas for future work? From my perspective, I always want to try and do some more advanced models. So I think some more advanced models to consider some specific data limitations, or maybe some results like that fixed speed safety camera estimate. So we can account for some of those. We can do that. And then what I found interesting is some of the 2020 sites had an increase, few had a decrease. And so collecting another round of data for this particular set of roadway classifications, the arterial and collectors, and comparing to the 2020 and 2021 results would be pretty interesting in my opinion. Essentially, we'd be asking the question, are trends, going back to pre-pandemic norms, or are these trends the new norm? Are these trends the trends to stay? So here's if you have access to the slides after today's seminar, here's all the references. And if you're interested in more on the residential streets, here's a link to a journal article for the residential streets. And with that, I'm sure Clay and myself would be happy to take questions. Jennifer.
I'm going to kick this off and remember to repeat the question. So the bottom line on the last slides were 2% or 2.7% overall reduction. Some people might say, oh, 2%. Like, is that a lot? Is that like, are you happy with those results? How do you put that in perspective?
Sure. Do you want to take a? Sure. So based on previous research, we often see in the 1% range, a little less than 1%, maybe a little higher than 1%. So getting these results of 2% and 2.7% relative to previous research is a significant reduction. Oh, yeah. Let's just.
It's fine.
We
Okay.
can just hand it back and forth.
Okay.
That works.
And I will say we would like to see more significant reductions. And I think that's where the research on the kind of interventions on the street, on street design changes are really important to continue to pair with those speed reductions. But we're thrilled that there was some measurable reduction.
Let's go this way.
We had across the board like a 7 to 10% reduction in the first speed limit. All of the treatment, the treatment lengths.
This
Most of
slide.
the speed limits went from 35 to 30.
Sure.
So that is a 20% in some cases down to, let's say, 10% decrease in the posted speed limit. But the average speed only reduced by 1%.
A little more than 2%. And then with the fixed speed safety cameras, it was closer to like 4.5 with the disaggregate models.
But you know what I'm getting at?
I think-
The speeding has to have increased in terms of percent over the posted speed.
And we observed that for a lot of the 2020 data. We observed that, which is why we attempted to capture that through the modeling process by creating those indicators for that 2020 data. Oh, sorry.
Roadway conditions and weather taken into account for your measure, such as if you measure the winter versus the summer, your 24 hours would be less daylight, rain on the roadway.
So the question was about accounting for weather-related environmental conditions during the data collection process.
Yeah.
Is that right?
We kind of the parameters on data collection that we usually use are Tuesday through Thursday and kind of morning or afternoon collection times. We'll run collections for that 3-day window, but often kind of focus on those morning and afternoon. We're collecting traffic speed data kind of year round, and I don't know that you were kind of pulling out speed data for specific times of year based on weather or light conditions.
Cameron.
Subject to ODOT's requirements, setting speed limits.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, ODOT is kind of determines speeds throughout the entire state, no matter who owns the roadway. We've kind of worked with ODOT and legislative partners to build in this new flexibility to more efficiently and kind of with more kind of urban context in mind to be able to push those ranges for setting speed limits down. But I guess the caveat is that the legislation that passed in 2021, now it gives ODOT the opportunity to delegate speed setting authority to local jurisdictions. And so that's through a process where the city would go to the state and request the authority to set speed limits. Will still, which Portland will do, will still be kind of confined to that methodology that we shared, but will certainly be able to more efficiently change speed limits. Good question. Do you know?
I don't know.
Yeah. We'll get back to you.
You mentioned the 2 and 2.7, you said 50 speed. Was that an average speed? And do you think you were selling yourself short by possibly not focusing on the higher percentile speed?
And that's a great question. And so these are based on what we define the dependent variable as in our regression model, which is just the observed speeds. So this would be on just the observed speeds. I mean, we are taking a mean and an average in the modeling process. But yes, in regards to selling ourselves short with not focusing on the speed buckets, if I'm understanding the question properly. So if we look at this slide, it's why I really wanted to focus on the speed buckets that had both a reduction and the speeding treatment. And these were the most effective. As we see, with the exception of one site, every site observed or experienced a decrease in all of these different speed relating metrics. When we get into the sites that didn't have any speed treatment, some of the results are mixed. Granted, we still do see the majority of sites with reductions in those 5 mile per hour greater, 15 mile per hour and 10 mile per hour greater. But I really just wanted to focus on the effect of both the speed limit reduction as well as the speeding treatment, which kind of goes back to when Clay was explaining about how it's more than just this single facet, it's a multifaceted process in setting these safe speeds and getting safe driving behavior. Next. Oh, go for it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, I spent a year living in Oslo in Norway from 2019 to 2020, and kind of are there things that kind of are being done in Oslo or in Norway that we should be considering and, you know, looking to evaluate here? It's a great question. Something I've actually reflected on a lot. From kind of a bigger picture, not kind of as specific as, what are specific treatments that we should be evaluating. It's a pretty different context. I would say that Oslo has been very aggressive in pairing pricing, disincentives to drive, and removing parking in the central city with excellent transit. And they've really made kind of those dual investments together in a way that we haven't seen in the United States, not just in Portland. And that is kind of, one of the cruxes of how we're going to make a really significant shift in kind of our traffic safety and slowing speeds, is really helping support this shift out of vehicles and onto other modes. In addition, there is a social safety net in Norway that doesn't exist here and is really critical to meeting basic human needs that we see play out on Portland streets in many ways, including in traffic safety. And so that's what often trips me up at figuring out like what's transferable and relatable. That said, there are very few, trying to see if I can think of any 5-lane arterial streets that cut through urban centers. And so I think there, certainly is, that's really where Portland's work is focused right now, is on taming our biggest, fastest, widest streets. And I think there are lessons learned from not only Norway, but also, Bogota and kind of places around the world in that space. Automated enforcement is also a tool that's more aggressively used in Oslo and other countries. And I think one technique that they use on their highway system is to have a bunch of camera boxes and then move cameras around. And so not all of the boxes are active all of the time. And it's something that our cameras aren't quite set up for that, but I think to explore is how do you kind of give this incentive to slow down without really having that heavy-handed enforcement at kind of all locations. As far as particular treatments, I'm going to have to ruminate on that a little bit to see kind of what we could be doing more here, but I really appreciate the question. Chris? Do you know where the speed data was collected relative to the camera? That's the question.
That's the question? Yeah, I didn't check to see where it was relative to the camera. We have the geo coordinates. We had the geo coordinates. I don't know if they were the exact location or not relative to where the speed cameras were. So I'd have to check on that. Yeah, so I didn't check that site for additional information in regards to traffic volumes or anything. The increase or the proportion was a bit larger relative to all the other ones, which was why I suspected that we were seeing those modeling results from that. That site would require a little bit further investigation. And then just to clarify the previous question about the 2% and 2.7%, because I think my answer was terrible the last time. So these are the mean effects. We're estimating some mean effect on what we would expect to observe if we were to go out there and observe a speed. And so that's what these are representing.
And just a reminder when you talk the question.
You got it.
Observe any differences in speed reductions at different times of day, like normal or afternoon?
So the question was about speed reductions during different times of day. And the short answer is no. So for the descriptive component, we didn't break out by times of day and look at different times of day and how speed trends were in these particular periods. We consider the whole data collection period, holistically for each one of those sites. However, for the modeling approach, as we see some of those indicators or site specific controlling factors, we did break up different time of day periods. And so this slide here shows that, we have a time of day period for 6 to 10 a.m., 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. And so the coefficient column tells us whether that particular time bin or the observed speeds during that time bin were expected to be lower or higher. So in this modeling component, this tells us that we would expect speeds to be lower in that 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. range, but beyond estimating the effects by controlling for them in the modeling approach, we did not consider it for the descriptive portion of the analysis.
On that, would you say that that's kind of your proxy for congestion in this, or how do you, I guess, it seems like the increases that you observe
Sure.
could be like congestion could need to roll that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think time of day in any type of scenario with traffic data, particularly crash data, which I do a lot of work in, is sort of a proxy for congestion based on how you define those time bins. Because the 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. goes a bit outside of what we would consider that traditional evening peak hour, is likely why we're seeing that, that this has a positive effect. If we were to cut that bin down, I expect we'd see similar results to that 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. because it would be picking up congestion in that time frame as well.
I was wondering, so like going back to sort of the reduction, so looking at like the speeds that were already going on the streets that you were measuring, how much of a reduction would it take to sort of get compliance to like a level where like it's like the pre-COVID sort of like you said you noticed like an increase in speeding, like so how big a reduction would you need to see to like actually get pre-COVID numbers?
Do you want to take a shot?
Sure.
Yeah, so the question was what type of reduction in speed would we need to see pre-pandemic levels, if I understand correctly?
Of just the speed, like people going
Of people going over the speed limit. Yeah, so I mean, I'm personally not fully aware of what the plethora of statistics are for people speeding pre-pandemic, particularly in these locations. And so with that information, we could go back and see kind of where this 2021 and 2020 data stacks up with that type of data and make some preliminary findings from that. But without that before data, it's a pretty difficult question to answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. It's a good question.
Oh, I thought you were going for it.
For a practitioner, if the effect of changing posted speed limit is relatively trivial compared to the effect of physical traffic, where do you recommend cities put the limited resources?
Limited resources. Oh yeah. The question is if it's pretty small gains with speed limit setting decreases, where do you recommend cities put their limited resources? We all struggle with this. It's a really good question. There's lots of levels of investments that we can make as cities or other jurisdictions. And we know that transforming our biggest, most dangerous streets is really critical to this work. We just made major safety investment on Outer Division Street. Those who are local to Portland will know it. And that is the type of transformation that we really need with Vision Zero. That said, it's taken us many years to get the funding put together, get the planning process put together, go through project development and construction. And so we need to be doing both, everything. And so I would say that for our work in Portland, that setting the speed limit is setting the expectation. It's setting kind of the expectation of, given the characteristics and the road users on this road, what is the appropriate speed to travel at? And if one has the authority or can kind of work with a state or county partner to change that speed limit, it takes some staff time, but it's a really important expectation to set on our streets. And that's not enough. You can't just do that. So I'm not sure I'm going to help the person asking the question online, because yes and yes, you need to both kind of set that speed limit and change that, which can be relatively quick compared to major street redesign projects and can be effective. In partnership, adding kind of those street calming, speed calming elements is really important, but I'd say don't wait. That's one thing we're really trying to do, is do what you can now. In addition to speed bumps, we've also kind of followed New York City's model and added left turn traffic calming elements to the street to really slow speeds of people making left turns. In Portland, 20% of pedestrian crashes occur at signals where a driver is making a left turn and hits a pedestrian who has the right of way in the crosswalk. That's the #1 interaction of how pedestrians are hit. And so really looking at the data to also do pretty quick, cheap interventions that address kind of what you know from impacts on your streets. And then keep working hard on getting larger funds for the big interventions.
Portland has seen a reduction in the number of officers in the police force, and they've been swept in. They happen concurrently with COVID. Was speed enforcement or inability to focus on speeding drivers figured in the comparison of all of the forces?
The question is, there was a reduction in the traffic division with the Portland Police Bureau that happened about the same time that COVID launched, and has less speed enforcement been considered in the time periods that we're looking at in this study. Is that summarizing it? I mean, Jason, you may want to take a crack at this. I would say that that has not been a factor that has influenced or really been a part of this study. We're really just looking at before and after. There's lots that changed in our 2020 kind of experience in this world. And COVID, VMT dropping, speeds increasing, less police enforcement of speeding on the streets, racial justice movement, right? It all like is kind of a part of that experience of 2020. And we're not kind of accounting for that in looking at pre and post speed data, while recognizing that there are lots of influences for why numbers may go up or down in the period that we're looking at. And maybe that's a plug to continue the research that you were suggesting.
So, impending wide-scale adoption of electric vehicles, which weigh far more than the equivalent internal combustion vehicle. Does PBOT have a plan to mitigate further danger to pedestrians on
I would say this is oh, I need to repeat the question. So the question is about electric vehicles, kind of the impending taking off of electric vehicles on our streets, and the assertion that they weigh more than their internal combustion engine vehicle counterparts. Do we have a plan to kind of understand and address the potential increased dangers associated with that heavier vehicle? Is that correct? So I don't know that, I didn't know electric vehicles weigh more than a similar internal combustion engine. But I would say that kind of broader than kind of, you know, combustion engine versus electric vehicle is really the size of the vehicles that we're seeing having dramatically increased on our streets in the last 5 or 10 years. And that is a very big concern for traffic safety. We are, you know, we don't have a lot of levers at the city of Portland to kind of get at vehicle size, but there's a few things that we're kind of looking at or engaging in. The new car assessment program was open recently for comments, and we joined other NACTO cities in submitting comments to really call for stronger, like in order to get a 5-star rating, to have stronger requirements for detecting and providing safety for people outside of vehicles, for automated braking, and speed limiters. And so there's, you know, kind of this federal kind of policy space that's really important, where cities are trying to kind of insert influence. And then there's examples of New York City has put a restriction on the size of freight vehicles that are allowed to drive on streets within New York. And there's kind of, I think some cities, certainly internationally, are really looking at limiting the size of fire trucks. And both limiting size of vehicles, it's a benefit for safety. Obviously, mass and speed, you know, kind of contribute to velocity, and that's really where kind of the most dangerous outcomes happen, is with heavy vehicles at high speeds. But it also kind of moving towards smaller vehicles helps with city design and being able to design streets that accommodate tighter turning movements and kind of contribute to slowing speeds. So there's some examples of ways that, you know, cities can look at speed, size, and weight that Portland's continuing to explore. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.